Hi, my name is Mark and welcome to The Active Listener, where we aim to listen, not just hear. We firmly believe that everyone has an interesting story to tell, if given the space to do so. So listening to what our guests have to say, you may learn something. So welcome back, Léa, for part 2 of our podcast. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I was very much looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent, thank you. So, yes, good to have you back. And we're going to be moving on to talk a little bit about leadership. And I know you had something specific in mind, so unpack that a little bit for me.
Yes. Well, where I wanted to go today was really around the responsibility that we have towards other people's development. And so perhaps the best way of framing this conversation would be, as a leader, where do your responsibilities start and stop with your team's development? And the reason I was delving into that is because I've had a number of conversations with people who tend to take responsibility for the actual development of their own staff, and when their own staff or colleagues or teammates either refuse that development or aren't ready for it or don't engage in a development trajectory, it can be lived as a personal failure to have engaged in our team's development. And it can be seen as, is it because your leadership is not of good enough quality that people don't become the very best version of themselves? So I thought it was, because this conversation has happened quite a few times, I wanted to perhaps provide an idea as to what you're responsible for as a leader and where those responsibilities stop with your teammates or colleagues or the people that you're responsible for.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting and good, because certainly where I work, and certainly in the past where I've worked, we've always had some sort of structure in terms of staff development and discussion. We'd call them continuous conversations or 360-degree feedback. And various companies take different stances on that. It could be, right, I've identified these are your learning points and I think you should work on these. Others will be much more from the point of view of the colleague saying, I've identified this and we kind of work together in it. So what, in your opinion, would be the way forward?
So I think there's the leader in a team. So say you have a team and you're in that position where people report into you. It's understanding what does fall onto your desk and what you are responsible for and what is of their own responsibility. So I had a conversation recently with someone who was in charge of 4 people, a team of 4. And her subliminal belief was that the quality of her leadership and the quality of the atmosphere that she provided for her team should be sufficient for people to become the very best version of themselves. So when the frustration came that wasn't happening, because even though she had a very supportive and inclusive environment for her team, people still had the same limiting self-beliefs, the lack of confidence. She almost took it personally because she felt that she wasn't capable of getting them to the next stage. So there was a piece of reassurance that A, wasn't her job, and that requires a very specific skill set that she does not possess because it's not her day job. And so her taking responsibility for something that isn't her job and that she doesn't have the skills for, but yet taking all the guilt and the feeling of failure, for me was actually quite heartbreaking. So I had to reassure her that people's development, A, they have to want it, and B, there are people who know how to do this, who do this all day long, and that's their role. So I thought a lot about what I would, if I had to have that conversation again, what I would share with her. So one is that we're all responsible for ourselves. So as a CEO myself, it's my responsibility to ensure that I do continual professional development, that I get coached, that I ensure that I'm always trying to improve, and that I'm constantly learning because things constantly change. So I have to keep being able to adapt. So I have to know about them. I have to learn new things. But that's my responsibility. It's no one else's job to make sure it happens, and it's no one else's jobs to make me want that. So it's my responsibility to take my own development, but I achieve that by going to professionals who can help me with that development. It's not for me to do it on my own. And why that sentence is important is because it's also my colleagues' responsibility to do to take ownership of their own development. So yes, the next piece is that it's my job to ensure that I create an environment where learning and development and coaching is seen as a good thing, that there are lots of advantage to it, that it's not taboo. There's still a very big stigma perhaps around personal development and coaching, that it's seen as, if you're going there, it's because you need to be fixed, it's because you can't do it on your own. So for me, I'm very, very open with the fact that I get coaching, that I get counseling, that I learn. So last year I was on 3 different training programs to learn new skills, so not development, but skills training. So I was on a sales and marketing training courses, and 3 different ones. So that's my responsibility, to make sure that other people know that learning and development is a wonderful thing, and all of the new things it brings. And I can see, people got excited when I'd learnt these new sales and marketing skills. They can start implementing them, and then suddenly they want to learn more about it, and then they're forthcoming with their requests for their own development. But if they weren't, there's, you can only bring a horse to water, but you can't force them to drink. So there's nothing personal against me. It's not because I'm not necessarily doing it properly or well enough. It might just be that person isn't in a place right there in their life where they're interested or available for any development. My responsibility really is to create an atmosphere so where that growth is is encouraged, because necessarily growth comes with making mistakes, with trying something and being a bit uneasy with it to start with. So making sure that people feel safe in trying new things, that they are welcomed with new initiatives, and that there is a very supportive atmosphere around them to enable them to engage in their own learning.
It seems to me it's much more about a cultural thing. We're creating a space where people feel comfortable to initiate training, to ask for training. In fact, we're encouraging that space within training, so that then people are growing and there's an excitement and a buzz where people can help one another out. And I guess where you're talking about responsibility, perhaps as a CEO, is that you're modeling that, or that you'll help instigate that culture and feed it. Because then by each of us taking responsibility for ourselves, we grow and then make the team a better one to work within.
Absolutely. And I had that on my list, that that leading by example. It's not by me being perfect and knowing everything. It's me admitting that I don't know everything and that I need to go and get some training, because I think that's still quite an assessment that CEOs should know everything. But if you go and get some training and development, it means you didn't know everything. So can we still trust you in that position up there where you're supposed to know everything? So I think it's a very strong message in itself, that continual learning is a good thing, that as a CEO, no, I don't know everything. And, that constant curiosity and willingness to engage in new territory is a good thing. And I'm making that message, I'm sharing that message to everyone in my team, that at every level, learning and trying new things and admitting that we don't know is a good thing. And it's what we do about it after.
How do you strike the balance between absolute honesty in the sense of, look, I'm still learning this, I'm not an expert, I'm referring to so-and-so over there, or I need your help on this, and that fostering a sense of honesty and openness which other people feel comfortable in acknowledging their strengths and areas they're not so strong at? How do you go from that to the other side being so honest and it actually doesn't foster trust? And what I mean by that is like, well, Mark's been absolutely frank here. He's not really good at communications or whatever it is. So I can't really tell him X, Y, Z to get that covered because he's just going to let us down. And it then goes down through the thing. So there is a lack of trust in someone's competence. So how do you strike the balance between open and honesty in order to foster growth and encouragement and everyone else to be open and honest, and competence, whereas you're not saying too much and then destroying the morale?
I'm in a bit of a comfortable position because being a CEO is really being a generalist. So even though I've got a strong subject matter background, so I know about what we sell at Leadership Trust, I'm not a finance person and I'm not a sales person. I'm not a marketing person. So I need to know the top line of it. But then I've got the luxury of saying, it's not my job to know it, but I want to know how it works. And so, for example, right now, the sales and marketing piece, during the pandemic, the provision of learning and the sales and marketing of learning has completely changed, because of the pandemic. So I wanted to upskill myself to understand, how do you better use, digital marketing, social media, online communities, and these new types of marketing processes that I could see. Actually, and this is sort of the meta element of learning, is I enrolled in some courses and I could see how they were delivering their material, and I was like, that is amazing. So even though I was doing courses on how to market courses, in itself I was learning a lot. So my luxury is that it's easy for me to say I don't know anything about sales and marketing because it's not my job. So now that I've gone through this training, I'm a beginner at sales and marketing, but I understand the bigger principles. And so now I can say, so I've dabbled in a few things and it's worked incredibly well. So now I can go out to the team and say, well, if we had someone on the team who actually knows what they're doing, imagine how we can really pour gasoline on the fire and really make it explode. I was hesitating there because I thought it was a very bad example considering the current circumstances. But, to really make it grow. So I think you're right. There's a balance to be hit in between admitting to ignorance and therefore being categorized as someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. For me, you solve this by doing something about it. So if I came to you and I said, if you were my boss and I say, look, the reason I want to learn this is because I think that this can help the company in this way. And I can see the application, but I just have to learn how to do it, you'd probably say yes, because you can see the benefit of how me gaining that knowledge would help out with the common purpose.
It's interesting what you're saying there also about taking responsibility for one's own learning. And if you've got a culture that fosters that obviously makes it easier. But it seems to me that having responsible for oneself anyway is a key thing to have a positive impact both on oneself but also those around and for whoever you work with and for. So unpack that a little bit about the self-responsibility.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question mark, and this is where you can really see the difference in between learning and development. So when it comes to learning skills, it's very easy to take responsibility for that, because now you can learn pretty much anything in the world by going onto YouTube. I learned how to read balance sheets by going onto YouTube and having this really funny American guy in his basement in Florida explaining how things worked. Development is slightly different because it usually happens in a blind spot. So the real value in development is providing you with a new light on elements of yourself that you weren't aware of before. And that is more complicated because you don't know what you don't know. So I think it's more of a practice, and I think that's the hygiene of development, is that it's not necessarily something that comes from a place of need, because when you're not aware of it, you don't know what you're missing. So if I can give an example of that in my own development, I discovered very recently how there's a direct link in between personal boundaries and margins. And the reason with that is because if you don't have strong personal boundaries in your life, you don't have strong boundaries with your clients. So we once had a client where we were organizing an event and we were still very much driven by, client is king, whatever they ask, you give it to them. Except we hadn't read the whole thing, that the client is king, whatever they want, you give it to them and you make them pay for it. So with this particular client, we reorganized the same event 7 times because they wanted to change the location of the event. So, it had to be in this place, and then it was more convenient and we redid it 7 times. And that was directly linked to us, collectively not daring to say to the client, well, yes, we want to serve you, but in our contract it says this, and we're going to apply it because we didn't want to apply that boundary. We were worried that the client would walk away. We were worried that the client would think that we weren't, going the extra mile, but, that was 7 extra miles to make the event work. And so I would never have been aware of that if I hadn't done this piece of development. And when it smacked me in between the eyes, I was like, oh my goodness. So, establishing boundaries in the workplace is directly linked to gross profit margin. You can't compute that before you've actually gone through it. So there's an element of that development, because my development is a continual practice. I always work with new coaches. Well, it's not that I change coaches all the time, but there are coaches that are specialized in different areas. I'm always curious to see what new light can be provided to me on certain things, and this one has just been so interesting. But it only comes because I've got that hygiene of, I'm always discovering things, and every time you go up in your career, you've got new challenges, new things that pop up. So it's not something that you do once and then you're fixed for a lifetime. It's a continual practice. And then, just those constant surprises because you're having that practice. And I think that's maybe a way to start talking about it more than coaching sessions. It's a coaching practice that's ongoing.
So it sounds like to me it's a matter of continuous learning. You're constantly learning. It's that culture or attitude of learning. Aside from that, you mentioned earlier that there's a taboo, perhaps centered in that I've got to know everything, whatever it is, but certainly for some, the idea of seeking help or seeking a coach or counsellor for that matter would be a weakness. Where do you think that comes from is the first question. And the second question related to that is, what can we do about that?
That's a really, really good question. I don't think I have an answer to that. I think I've got elements of response. And I think it's going to get better and better because we're removing stigma from mental health considerations. So I think there's still very much a stigma that counselling or psychotherapy or coaching is a form of therapy. So that was one of my big things when I was in various forms of therapy. For me, the mere fact it's called therapy is a problem because it's not that I'm broken and I need fixing. It's I'm learning my own user guide. And if that's how we talked about it, that you have these behaviors because this is your internal process map. Well, there's nothing complicated about that, but because it's called therapy, it's you're a bit ill and you're a bit dirty. You have to go to therapy to get better. So I think there's still very much that stigma, and that coaching is seen as a form of therapy. People still think that a coach is a shrink, which is not the case. And I always go back for that when people mention that. I say, well, Roger Federer, the best tennis player of, in my view, the history of tennis, he has a coach, and it's not because he doesn't know how to play tennis, it's because he needs someone looking at him from the outside and giving feedback on what their point of view is telling them that he can't see because he is where he is. And you wouldn't go and tell Roger Federer that he's got a coach because he's not good at what he's doing. He's got a coach because it's a great element to help him perform even better. So I think in our profession, we've got a lot of work to do to get people to understand that coaching or other forms of support are there to help you perform even better rather than remedial coaching. And I think that's probably when coaching first started to become a bit more widespread. There was a lot of remedial coaching that was done. It was like, that person, needs fixing, bring the coach in. So if you were offered a coach, it was because you needed sorting out, you weren't a good team player. So there's all, if you need help, it's because you can't do it on your own. So I think what we can do about it is, proudly share that, we do coaching and it's a good thing to do, and it's not because there's anything wrong with us. And I think, we'll always have a job to convince other people, and some people have very strong opinions about it, but I think generally, generationally, I mean, the people who are resistant to that growth or to that, support form are sort of getting closer to the end of their career, and the new generation, I think, is a lot more open to talking about many things. And I think mental health organizations have done a fantastic job in taking away the stigma so we can talk a lot more about it. And, in a much easier way. So I think it's a gradual process, really.
To me, that is part of the culture. I mean, certainly with people I've managed in the past, I've always encouraged, certainly since I've become a coach at least, encouraged that coaching culture.
I love that new concept, coaching.
There you go. It was coined here, coaching. It's a coaching culture, or coaching,
exactly.
Where it's normalized. And if you have a place that's like that, where you can be open and honest about areas that you need to learn and grow in, then it's good for everyone. But you need to have that position where we are kind of signed up to that, and there's an element of trust there. Now, that's not going to be right for everyone, and I think that's perhaps where it's clear where boundaries are, and where, perhaps as an organization, this is where we are, or this is what we stand for, so that people can then think, well, okay, that's not for me, because that's not going to work for everyone. Now, I can stand back, obviously, as a coach and say, well, I think this is the best way, and it's going to make you stronger. But as you sort of made reference to earlier, you can't make someone do something. And it comes back really to what you're talking about in regards to a manager helping to develop someone. There has to be an engagement with an individual. They need to want to, and you're not there to say, right, you must do this, because that's not going to be beneficial for either party.
Yeah. And I think that there's a very, what you were saying about boundaries is really important, and respect for where that person is in their development. Even though I'm a huge consumer of coaching and other forms of support, there are some times where a lot of change is happening, and then it just has to sit in a corner for a bit, so I'm not available for it. And I think respecting that development trajectory is also really important. So I know that some companies have tried sort of compulsory, like whatever, quarterly meeting with your career coach or something. And I think there's a balance to be held in between it being completely employee driven, individually driven, and company policy. So I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what the solution is. Probably a case by case basis, and that's where leadership is even more important.
Exactly. I think an observation as well would be, it's often when people feel something is being done to them that they will balk or become stressed or not want to do it, because they have no involvement. And rather than someone feeling something's been done to them, they want to feel, well, I'm involved in this. It's a two-way process. Whether that at that point, that two-way process is happy for them, they're happy to step back and say, no, I'm happy for you to do that. I don't want any involvement. That's fine. But it's often the freedom of choice. And when someone feels their choice has been taken away, and it's like, we are doing this, that can be very stressful.
Yeah. And create huge resistance.
Absolutely.
For then and in the future. If coaching had been forced onto me, it would probably have broken the whole attraction of coaching there and forever.
Yeah.
But I thought I've just got 3 points on. So I shared what we are responsible for as leaders when it comes to our teammates, colleagues, development, what we're not responsible for. So if you're responsible for creating a fertile environment for learning and development where people feel safe in learning, in taking the initiative of their learning, in being interested in their development, you've done your job as a leader. And if you're role modeling that interest in learning and development and constant growth, you really have done your job. What is not your job is doing the development itself. So whilst you can use coaching skills to get the very best out of your team by using coaching skills to help them do their job, coaching them as a boss is not your direct responsibility, or should not be expected. If you do have that relationship with them and you are a qualified coach and you have that relationship, that's great. But by default, it's not your responsibility. One, because they might want to talk about you in their coaching sessions, but also because coaching is a real job. You need a lot of training to be able to do it properly. And it's a lot of work. It takes up a lot of time, which is not your job. So you can't be expected to coach your own team and deliver on your day job. The development itself, so whether it's coaching or whether it's training itself or whether it's organizing the off-site events where you can get to the bottom of the team dynamics and all of that, that is also a very skillful job, which people are trained to do that. They do that every day. And I think it's really important not to take that responsibility yourself. Facilitated meetings are great. All the leadership development that you can hope for is available out there. So delegate, call on professionals to do that job, because yes, it might cost a bit of money, but the return on investment will be much better than if you're doing it yourself, because also if you're doing it yourself, you can't take part in it, and that team dynamic cannot function without you. So delegate that to someone else. And actually my last point really is, it's the same about the training more than the development. So, any skills training, there are people out there who teach the skills that are required. So it's not your job either to train them. You can make them want to train and get them excited about it, but the actual doing, make sure that that's delegated to others.
So it sounds like one of the key things there is the delegation. It's recognizing what you can do and how you as a CEO or as a manager can encourage, as a leader, others to grow and feed and provide them the opportunity. But it's also recognizing what isn't your skill set, and that there are people who can much more effectively, not just in terms of their background and skill set, but in also utilization of time, can support your people to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're going to move on to finish up. And could you tell me an interesting fact about yourself, or something you're most proud of? And they may be one of the same, or they may be two separate things.
There's quite a few. I'll stick to one. And in the theme of this podcast, I think probably what I'm most proud of is my own personal development, because of the impact I can see it has on others. So going through your own development, it can be a painful process. You've got a lot, growing is not necessarily a comfortable process. I've set up an organization in France that matches rescue horses with veterans, and one of our veterans is going into the circuit to qualify for the Paris 2024 Olympics on one of our horses. So I'm very proud of the whole thing. And I got a phone call from the head of operations, and she was very upset because the feed for the horse was wrong. And I said, oh, what's happened? Because, the trainer had come and he was looking at the performance of the horses, and he was like, oh, they're not endurant enough to become, to get them to Grand Prix. And she was really upset. She thought she'd made a terrible mistake. And it's only because our horses have been going up the levels, and you don't feed a horse the same food when they're operating at Grand Prix than when they're operating, much earlier in the circuit. So I completely reframed it to her, and I said, but it's because we're not beginners anymore. So this is a sign of success. And for her, it was, this complete revelation that it's not that she'd made a mistake or she'd got it wrong. It's just, you're doing really well, and that's why the change has to happen. And to see how it, the light bulb going off in her head, I saw it happening, and I could see the pride, and I would not have been able to do that if I hadn't done all of the development that I'd done. So I think seeing the impact that I have on other people as a result of my development is one of the things I'm proudest of.
That's really powerful. That's a lovely story as well. Okay, so favourite song or piece of music?
I think anything played by a wonderful lady called Susie Napper. So she is an amazing leader in the field of Baroque music. She plays viola da gamba. She specializes in Baroque music, and the Baroque period is a really interesting one in the history of music because it was pretty much probably the equivalent of punk rock, in the 20th century when it came out, because it was so at odds with music before that. And she has amazing interpretations of it, and she is so open to so many different styles. On one piece, John Sebastian Bach wrote an opera but didn't get to finish it, and she was involved in imagining what the end of this opera would sound like. And she got DJs involved, she got Baroque musicians, and it was just like this amazing collaboration. And people might have this belief that classical music can be very stifled, but she brings so much air and curiosity and creativity into it. So anything played by Susie Napper.
So what's really exciting about that is I'm very much into fusion. So I had years ago now, I did a collaborative piece I headed up based out of Desert Island Disc, so the Radio 4, and it was in response to something Paul Gambaccini said when he was talking about underrepresentation of certain music. He said, well, that's because of the dynamic of the people we listen to. And I was like, well, hold on a minute. I'm not really sure I like what you're saying there, because you're pigeonholing people in terms of who listens to what. So I basically went out and did this questionnaire with loads of people from various backgrounds and took their portraits. I took their song choices, and they had lots of different styles of music. And what was really interesting is that across the board, most people had classical music, regardless of whoever they were. It didn't necessarily mean they really loved classical music, but it meant something to them. And it was interesting as well how people would choose music because of the part that they were in life at that time. So anyway, it came to the launch night, and I had a poet, a dancer, and a friend of mine's a DJ. And so he mixed Rachmaninoff with reggae. So he had literally the whole gambit of this different stuff. And then I had someone dance. It was so cool.
No, but that's amazing. For me, this is leadership in any setting. Leadership isn't just business and politics. It's leadership in music. What you achieved required amazing leadership skills. And what Susie is achieving.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But thank you. I'll try and dig out the video, and you can...
I'd love that.
Tell me about a person you admire.
Actually, I would talk about Manon. So Manon is the head of stables, head of operations, everything in the horse initiative that I'm involved with. It's just everything about her. She works so hard. She's so determined, and she's so loving and caring. She's no nonsense, but you can see the love she has for all of the animals. The stable is cleaner than my house. She's a killer for hygiene. And that's really, really important with courses. When it comes to leadership, we always think of, these big, noisy, loud people, who go off and do amazing, heroic things. But she, quietly in the background, her leadership is incredible. And, if things are going the way they're going, it's, everyone's contributing. But that quiet, no nonsense, getting things done leadership, I think is something that's very overlooked. So I wanted to highlight it here.
Favourite food?
Oh, Vietnamese pho, no doubt.
And why particularly?
Well, my dad was born in Vietnam. Very complex life story. Grew up in a Japanese concentration camp. Parents fled, lived with his grandparents. And he never returned to Vietnam. So he left when he was 6. I think it was a bit of a painful experience. And when I started my career and I was making good money at the time, I always said to him, he funded my part of my studies, and my gift to him was to go back to Vietnam with him. And on our first evening in Hanoi, we just walked out and we had this amazing bowl of soup, and we've been having this soup forever in our family, but it was just the two of us. We sat down on these little stools on the side of the street, and it was this little old man that had an enormous vat of broth and just dished it all out, and it smelt amazing, and we were tired and jet lagged, and it was just like this wonderful intimate moment with my father. So emotion is in food, and this one definitely carries a lot of it.
That's amazing, thank you. A favourite place? So
I hesitate in there. So the stables definitely is one of them, but one of my favourite places at the moment is my flying school. So I'm taking my pilot license, and I absolutely love my flying school. It's one of the few flying schools that is owned and led by a female pilot. My flying teacher is an experiential flying teacher, so my first lesson with him, I did takeoff and landing, and he didn't seem to panic. That was a good thing. And it's just a wonderful place for me because my day job, I deal with human emotions. That's what I do. So going to a hangar where everything is mechanical engineering, you're pressing a button, this is going to happen. If it doesn't start, it's because you've got to do this. And it's very, very restful for me to just be able to be with machines that do as they're told every so often. So it's a good rest for my emotional intelligence organ.
And I imagine quite freeing as well.
Yes, definitely.
Finally, a favourite book, film or video game, or all three?
Well, I must confess I am a bit of a Game of Thrones fan. I think it's the best account of human nature since Shakespeare.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time, Léa, and really insightful stuff for sharing. So thanks for coming along.
Well, thank you, Mark, for having me, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. Until next time, remember, help people feel valued. Listen, don't just hear.